Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, the 2025 Ukraine deal X can't stop talking about. In early 2025, former and newly re-elected U.S. President Donald Trump reignited global attention with a bold claim: he could resolve Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine in one day through direct negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This statement, echoing his 2023 campaign rhetoric, sparked a firestorm of debates across platforms, particularly on X, where users ranging from geopolitical analysts to everyday observers dissected the feasibility, implications, and risks of such a deal. Trump's assertion, rooted in his self-styled deal-making prowess, raised questions about U.S. foreign policy, Ukraine's sovereignty, and the broader geopolitical landscape. This article delves into the nuances of Trump's proposed diplomacy, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's response, the fears of U.S. concessions to Russia, and the polarized reactions on X. Is Trump's plan a stroke of diplomatic genius or a reckless gamble? Let's unpack the debate, drawing on X posts, expert analysis, and critical perspectives. The context: Trump's one-day solution and its origins. Donald Trump's claim to end the Russia-Ukraine war in one day first gained traction during his 2023 presidential campaign. In a May 2023 CNN town hall, Trump asserted that he could broker peace between Putin and Zelensky within 24 hours by leveraging his personal relationships and deal-making skills. This rhetoric resurfaced in 2025, following his inauguration as the 47th U.S. president, when Trump reiterated his intent to negotiate directly with Putin to halt the conflict that began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The Russia-Ukraine war, now in its third year by 2025, has caused immense devastation, with tens of thousands of casualties, millions displaced, and global economic ripple effects. Ukraine, supported by Western military aid, has resisted Russian advances, reclaiming some territories but struggling to regain full control over occupied regions like Crimea and parts of Donbass. The conflict's complexity, rooted in historical, geopolitical, and economic tensions, makes Trump's promise of a swift resolution both audacious and contentious. On X, Trump's claim was met with a mix of optimism, skepticism, and alarm. Some users praised his willingness to prioritize peace, while others warned that a quick deal could favor Russia at Ukraine's expense. A post from White House on March 19, 2025, quoted Trump saying, "Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact that thousands of soldiers are being killed, and both President Putin and President Zelensky would like to see it end. That process is now in full force and effect." This statement fueled speculation about the nature of the proposed deal and its potential terms. Trump's diplomacy, a deal with Putin. Trump's approach to diplomacy with Putin has been characterized by personal engagement and a preference for bilateral talks over multilateral frameworks. Unlike the Biden administration, which prioritized NATO coordination and sanctions against Russia, Trump has emphasized direct negotiations, citing his past interactions with Putin during his first term, 2017 to 2021. In 2018, Trump met Putin in Helsinki, a summit that drew criticism for its perceived deference to Moscow. In 2025, Trump's renewed focus on Putin suggests a continuation of this approach, with an emphasis on pragmatic deal-making to achieve a ceasefire. According to posts on X, Trump's proposed deal reportedly includes several concessions to Russia. A February 19, 2025, post by @P_Kalianimi outlined potential terms. Russia would retain control over Crimea and occupied territories, Ukraine would abandon its NATO membership aspirations, U.S. troops would withdraw from Ukraine and possibly Europe, and Russia would receive sanctions relief, all without reciprocal concessions from Moscow. Another post by @Milovanov on June 1, 2025, echoed this, noting that Trump offered Putin a deal involving territorial concessions and NATO exclusion, which Putin rejected, demanding greater control over Ukraine's sovereignty. These reports, while not independently verified, align with Trump's public statements about prioritizing peace over prolonged military support for Ukraine. In a March 2025 interview, Trump criticized the endless flow of U.S. aid to Ukraine, arguing that American resources should focus on domestic priorities. This stance has raised concerns among Ukraine's allies, who fear that a Trump-brokered deal could undermine Kiev's position. Critical analysis. Is this diplomacy feasible? Trump's one-day claim hinges on the assumption that Putin and Zelenskyy are willing to negotiate and that he can leverage his influence to secure a deal. However, the conflict's entrenched nature suggests otherwise. Russia's demands, full control over annexed territories, Ukraine's neutrality, and the lifting of sanctions, are fundamentally at odds with Ukraine's insistence on restoring its 1991 borders and pursuing NATO integration. Trump's ability to bridge this gap in a single day seems optimistic at best. Experts argue that Trump's approach oversimplifies the war's complexities. Fiona Hill, a former U.S. national security official, noted in a 2025 analysis that Putin views the conflict as existential, aiming to weaken Ukraine and NATO. A quick deal could embolden Russia, signaling that aggression yields concessions. Conversely, supporters of Trump's plan argue that prolonged fighting benefits no one, and a ceasefire could save lives and stabilize global markets. The debate on X reflects this divide, with some users calling Trump a peacemaker and others labeling him naive or pro-Putin. Zelensky's response, defiance amid pressure. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has been vocal about his skepticism toward Trump's plan. In a June 19, 2025, post, Zelenskyy called Putin's attempts to portray himself as a mediator cynical, accusing him of exploiting negotiations to strengthen Russia's position. Zelenskyy has consistently rejected deals that involve ceding territory or abandoning NATO aspirations, arguing that such concessions would compromise Ukraine's sovereignty and embolden future Russian aggression. Zelenskyy's position is complicated by Ukraine's reliance on U.S. military and financial aid, which totaled over $75 billion from 2022 to 2024. With Trump signaling a potential reduction in aid, Zelenskyy faces pressure to negotiate, even on unfavorable terms. A post by NOIL Reports on April 29, 2025, suggested that Trump's proposed deal could end Zelenskyy's presidency and trigger chaos in Ukraine by forcing Kiev to accept territorial losses and shaky security guarantees. This sentiment underscores the domestic political risks for Zelenskyy, who has built his leadership on resisting Russian aggression. Zelenskyy's strategy, balancing resistance and realism. Zelenskyy's public defiance masks a pragmatic streak. In 2024, he expressed willingness to negotiate with Russia under certain conditions, such as international security guarantees and a clear path to NATO membership. However, Trump's reported terms, particularly the exclusion of NATO, conflict with Ukraine's long-term goals. Zelenskyy's challenge is to maintain domestic support while navigating pressure from a U.S. administration eager to resolve the conflict quickly. On X, Ukrainian voices like War Translated emphasized Zelenskyy's resistance to yielding sovereignty, noting that Russia's continued attacks during talks undermine Putin's credibility as a negotiator. This reflects a broader sentiment among Ukrainians that any deal must prioritize their nation's territorial integrity and security. Fears of U.S. concessions, a new Helsinki moment. One of the most contentious aspects of Trump's plan is the fear that it involves significant U.S. concessions to Russia. Posts on X, such as at AMB John Bolton's March 17, 2025, warning, suggest that Trump's personal hostility towards Zelenskyy and susceptibility to Putin's flattery could lead to a ceasefire heavily skewed in Moscow's favor. Critics draw parallels to the 1975 Helsinki Accords, where Western concessions to the Soviet Union were later criticized for legitimizing its control over Eastern Europe. Potential concessions and their implications. Based on X posts and expert analyses, the rumored concessions include territorial recognition, allowing Russia to retain Crimea and parts of Donbass, effectively legitimizing its 2014 and 2022 annexations. This would undermine international law, which recognizes these territories as Ukrainian. NATO exclusion, barring Ukraine from NATO membership, a long-standing Russian demand. This could weaken NATO's eastern flank and signal a retreat from U.S. commitments to European security. Sanctions relief, lifting economic sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014. This could bolster Russia's economy but reduce leverage over Putin's actions. U.S. Military withdrawal, reducing or eliminating U.S. military presence in Ukraine and possibly Europe, aligning with Trump's America First policy but potentially destabilizing NATO. These concessions, if true, could have far-reaching consequences. For Ukraine, they would represent a betrayal of its fight for sovereignty. For the U.S., they could strain relations with NATO allies, who have prioritized supporting Ukraine. Globally, they might embolden authoritarian regimes by demonstrating that aggression yields rewards. Expert perspectives, risks versus rewards. Analysts are divided on the implications of Trump's approach. David Ignatius, writing in the Washington Post, argued that Putin's rejection of Trump's offer in early 2025 was a strategic miscalculation, as Russia now risks losing leverage as the war drags on. Conversely, Michael McFaul, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, warned that conceding to Putin's demands could destabilize Eastern Europe and encourage further aggression, citing Russia's 2008 invasion of Georgia as a precedent. On X, the debate is equally polarized. Pro-Trump users argue that his willingness to negotiate directly with Putin demonstrates bold leadership, with some citing the Abraham Accords as evidence of his diplomatic success. Critics, however, warn of a Munich moment, where appeasement leads to greater conflict. A February 13, 2025, post by Max_Nafo_Fella highlighted Trump's urging of Zelenskyy to abandon hopes of reclaiming all lost territories, framing it as a capitulation to Putin. The X discourse, a platform divided. X has been a central arena for the global debate over Trump's Ukraine deal. The platform's real-time nature amplifies both informed analysis and polarized rhetoric, making it a microcosm of public sentiment. Below are key themes from X posts. Optimism for peace. Some users view Trump's plan as a pragmatic step toward ending a costly war. They argue that his unconventional approach, bypassing bureaucratic channels and engaging Putin directly, could break the stalemate. A common refrain is that Trump's deal-making skills, honed in business and politics, make him uniquely suited to negotiate with strongmen like Putin. These users often cite the human toll of the war, echoing Trump's March 2025 statement about thousands of soldiers being killed. Skepticism and alarm. Conversely, many X-users express alarm at the potential costs of Trump's deal. Posts like P_Kalianimi's February 19, 2025, thread criticized Trump for offering Putin significant concessions without securing meaningful benefits for Ukraine or the U.S. Others, like Oil reports, warn of domestic instability in Ukraine if Zelenskyy is forced to accept unfavorable terms. These users often frame Trump's approach as naive or overly deferential to Putin, with some accusing him of prioritizing personal legacy over geopolitical stability. Misinformation and polarization. As with any major geopolitical issue, X is rife with unverified claims and polarized narratives. Some posts exaggerate Trump's influence, suggesting he has already secured a deal, while others amplify Russian propaganda about Ukraine's weakness. The lack of official details about Trump's negotiations fuels speculation, making it critical to approach X posts with skepticism. Per the guidelines, these posts are treated as inconclusive, reflecting sentiment rather than fact. Is Trump's plan genius or risky? The question of whether Trump's plan is genius or risky hinges on one's perspective on diplomacy, power, and morality. Below, we evaluate both sides. The case for genius. Pragmatic peace. Trump supporters argue that ending the war quickly would save lives, reduce global economic strain, and refocus U.S. resources on domestic issues. The conflict has disrupted energy markets, contributing to inflation and food insecurity, particularly in Europe and the global South. Leveraging relationships. Trump's personal rapport with Putin, built over years of public and private interactions, could facilitate dialogue where multilateral efforts have stalled. His willingness to sidestep NATO's bureaucracy appeals to those who see the alliance as slow and indecisive, breaking the stalemate. The war's protracted nature suggests that neither side can achieve a decisive victory without catastrophic costs. A negotiated ceasefire, even if imperfect, could provide a framework for future talks. The case for risk. Appeasement risks. critics argue that conceding to Putin's demands would reward aggression, potentially encouraging further Russian incursions into Ukraine or other neighboring states. Historical parallels to Munich 1938 are frequently cited: undermining allies, a deal that sidelines NATO or reduces U.S. support for Ukraine could strain transatlantic alliances, weakening the West's collective security framework. Ukraine's sovereignty, forcing Ukraine to cede territory or abandon NATO aspirations would undermine its right to self-determination, potentially destabilizing Zelensky's government and fueling resentment among Ukrainians. That a balanced perspective, the truth likely lies in a gray area. Trump's willingness to negotiate directly with Putin could open channels for de-escalation, but the reported terms, territorial concessions, NATO exclusion, and sanctions relief, tilt heavily toward Russia's interests. Without reciprocal concessions from Moscow, such a deal risks legitimizing aggression and weakening U.S. credibility. Moreover, the one-day timeline is unrealistic, as trust-building and verification mechanisms would require months, if not years. The X discourse reflects this complexity, with users divided between those who see Trump as a bold peacemaker and those who view his plan as a dangerous capitulation. The lack of transparency about the deal's specifics fuels uncertainty, making it difficult to assess its viability fully. Broader implications: what's at stake? The outcome of Trump's proposed deal could reshape the geopolitical landscape. Ukraine's future: a deal that forces territorial concessions could destabilize Ukraine's government and embolden pro-Russian factions. Conversely, a balanced agreement could provide Ukraine with security guarantees and a path to rebuilding. NATO's role: excluding Ukraine from NATO or reducing U.S. military presence in Europe could weaken the alliance, potentially encouraging Russian assertiveness in the Baltics or Poland. Global precedent: a U.S. brokered deal that favors Russia could signal to other authoritarian regimes, such as China vis-a-vis Taiwan, that aggression yields concessions. U.S. domestic politics: Trump's handling of the Ukraine deal could shape his second term's legacy, either as a diplomatic triumph or a foreign policy blunder. Conclusion: navigating a high-stakes gamble. Donald Trump's claim to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war, in one day, has captivated global attention, sparking intense debates on X and beyond. His proposed diplomacy, centered on direct talks with Vladimir Putin, promises a swift end to a devastating conflict but raises fears of U.S. concessions that could undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and Western unity. Zelensky's defiance, coupled with the polarized discourse on X, underscores the challenges of balancing peace with justice. Is Trump's plan genius or risky? It's both. The genius lies in its bold attempt to break a deadly stalemate, leveraging personal diplomacy to achieve what multilateral efforts have not. The risk lies in its potential to reward aggression, weaken allies, and destabilize Ukraine. Without transparency and reciprocal concessions, the deal leans toward the latter. As the world watches, the stakes could not be higher, for Ukraine, for NATO, and for the global order. For the latest updates on this evolving story, follow the conversation on X or visit https://x.ai/grok for real-time insights from Grok 3. The path to peace is fraught with complexity, and only time will reveal whether Trump's gamble pays off.